you know that feeling when you walk into a museum, like, without knowing it, or without anyone telling you anything, you suddenly start whispering? I always do. I'm Sarah. I'm a curator turned storyteller, and I'm going to tell you 3 ways how museums make us feel uncomfortable and not at home. I always start whispering. I slow down. I lower my voice, and I know I'm a curator, but why do I stop laughing? It's almost like the building is telling us how we are supposed to behave. And for the longest time, I thought that this is how it's supposed to be. And I thought that this high culture atmosphere and the museums are what they are supposed to feel like. But now, when I look at these regulations or rules that you have to follow at museums, I realize that they are not for respect. Now, I'm not sure what they are for. Of course, many thinkers and intellectuals have had their own suppositions about this, like Michel Foucault, but I'm not going to go into that. Not too long ago, I was at one of these very famous museums, and you know those winged bowls, those enormous bowls that are made of stone and they are from ancient Assyria? Yeah, the ones with human faces and bull bodies and wings of an eagle. I'm talking about that. They were standing. They're exactly the way that they used to in ancient Assyria, which is now contemporary Iraq. And I was looking at them thinking, they've been standing for thousands of years. They're almost impossible to describe until you see them. They are massive. They're that kind of artifact that you instinctively tilt your head back just to be able to look at them. I remember just staring at them and, I was trying to imagine the people who carved them, the artisans, the masons, the palace it once guarded, the capital that was once made or founded by Sargon II. And these guards were guarding that capital. How many empires have come and gone while these stones were still there? Then I noticed someone who was standing a few meters away from me, and he looked like me, Middle Eastern, maybe Iraq, maybe Syria, I'm not sure, maybe somewhere else entirely. And I don't know where he was from, but the thing is, I remember perfectly the expression on his face. It wasn't the look tourists usually have on their faces. It wasn't, wow, this is very interesting, that object is impressive. It felt different. It felt almost personal. I had this feeling that he wasn't looking at these artifacts, he was just looking through them. He was looking at something that belonged to his story. And he stood there for a very long time, and he was completely still revering these objects. And then slowly, completely instinctively, he reached out his hands. Not to grab his phone to take a selfie, not to lean on anything. Just, I felt like he was going to touch the stone. Honestly, when you're standing in front of an object from thousands of years of your own story and history, right in front of you, wouldn't you want to at least know how it feels like? Just for once? Put that whole preservation thing aside. I know all about that, but I just want to know how you would feel about that. Like, for example, you have a family heirloom in your hands. Of course, the touch of that family heirloom is completely different, unique even, to your hands. And sometimes artifacts are the same. And then, before his fingers could even go near these objects, someone shouted. Really shouted. The guard from across the gallery started making these belittling gestures with his hands for no touching. The whole room just turned. The man froze immediately. He looked embarrassed, confused. The guard kept shouting and then started making these very short phrases. No, don't touch, you, no hands, like that. It all happened maybe in 15 seconds or less, but that 15 seconds was somehow enough for changing the atmosphere completely. And a moment that had felt so intimate and private suddenly turned into a very public moment of shame and embarrassment. The man stepped aside, put his hands behind his back, started going back, avoided eye contact, and he just walked away. Just like that. I remember watching him, and as I was watching him leave, I was thinking, why does this feel so wrong to me? I've been trained to look at these objects as objects of preservation, as things that have to be preserved intact for the future generations, and not touching them is one of its necessities. It was not about the guard stopping him either. I am all for object preservation, but I couldn't understand at the moment where this weird, unsettling feeling comes from. And that moment stayed with me. You know, the thing that was so shocking was how quickly someone could be made felt like they didn't belong. Like they're misbehaving in a very bad way. And the strange thing is, I knew that feeling. It was familiar. Because I felt it too. Remember in the last video I told you about my French mistake in front of one of the employees of École du Louvre? I felt excluded. And it was not the only time I've felt excluded in many, many museum institutions around the world, even in my own country. And the irony is that I worked in a museum myself. I've been a museum guide myself. And there were moments that I had to tell visitors not to touch the objects too. But every time I had to tell that, I felt ill at ease. I felt like I was doing something that is not fair, even though I am a complete advocate of object preservation. That made me wonder something that I honestly hadn't questioned before. Why do many museums make ordinary people feel like guests? Like they are some passengers instead of owners. Owners of the story, maybe. Because aren't these whole places supposed to belong to all of us? The question followed me home. And once it got into my head, I couldn't get it out. I started noticing things. Over the following weeks, after that incident, I started realizing that museums don't make us feel uncomfortable in just that way. They do it in 3 distinctive ways. And they are completely quiet. First, through the architecture itself, the scale of the building, these massive columns, the way the buildings are physically intimidating us, how we have to go across staircases just to approach the museum entrance. Second, through the economics. Who gets to enter? Who gets charged? And who ultimately is left out? And the more important question, who ultimately owns the history inside? And the third way, through the language, the dense, very intellectual, academic words called as museum speech or curator speech, on the walls that silently tell us we don't belong. 3 mechanisms, all working together. And most of us never even see them. That evening, I kept replaying that moment in my head. And it was not because someone got told off of course, that was really disturbing. But that happens in museums all the time, unfortunately. It was because of how quickly the room changed. 1 second, that man was looking connected, and the next second, he looked like he'd broken some sacred rule. And I started wondering, when did museums start feeling sacred? When did they start feeling like the religion or the temples of the modern world? Maybe from the start. And I will definitely talk about it with you. The strange thing is that I've been visiting museums my entire life. I've studied them, for God's sake. I've worked with them. I've even defended them. I wrote 2 dissertations and many articles in world-renowned journals on this matter, and yet, the second I walk into one of these museums, I still catch myself doing exactly what everyone else does. I lower my voice. I became strangely uncomfortable and careful about my behavior, and where I stand, if I'm taking too much space. Sometimes I even fold my hands in front of me. I'm afraid of, hitting something or taking too much space. Nobody tells me to do those things, but I do. I just instinctively do them. And then I started paying attention to the buildings. Not the collections, the buildings. Most of the world-famous museums don't look like ordinary public spaces. They were made and they were designed to be and look important. They have huge staircases, enormous doors, stone everywhere, and you don't just walk in, you approach them as if you have some kind of rites of passage to experience. Almost the way you'd approach a cathedral maybe, or a palace, or a temple, or a courthouse. Buildings that were designed to remind you that someone inside has authority. I don't think I ever questioned that before. By the way, I was trying to make those Lamassus, but I realized they are too difficult to make. Look! Ouch! They're too difficult to make. So I'm thinking about something else to make instead of that. And, yep. I don't think I ever questioned that authority before. I just accepted it as something museums are supposed to be like. But once I noticed it, I couldn't unnotice it, to be honest. Even inside, everything seems designed to slow you down. The ceilings are impossibly high. These footsteps that echo in the galleries. People instinctively whisper. It's funny, isn't it? Nobody walks into a supermarket and suddenly lower their voice, start speaking in a hushed tone. Nobody gets into a train station and thinking I'd better behave myself and be extra careful not to disturb the atmosphere. But museums, almost everyone does that. And I'm not saying that some grand conspiracy like these architects just huddled to think about how they can intimidate people. No, it wasn't like that. It's much more subtle than that. These buildings were often built and designed in the ages that museums weren't really imagined a place for everyone. They were places of prestige, of empires, of scholarship, of national pride maybe. And buildings have memories. Even when societies change, their architecture keep telling the same story, sometimes without even realizing it. That's what I find fascinating, because architecture doesn't just shelter us, it gives us messages, it teaches us. It quietly tells us how to behave, who belongs, who doesn't, who speaks confidently, who whispers. Maybe that's why that guard's voice felt so shocking to me. Not because he created the silence, because he broke it. The room was already doing most of the work. The building had already convinced me, and everyone else, that we have to be silent, and the silence was the correct language. The guard only enforced what the space had already taught us. I don't know. Maybe you've never felt that before, and honestly, if you have found museums welcoming and warm all the time, I'm really glad that you've had that experience. But that wasn't mine. I've never walked into one of these museums and immediately felt like I belonged. I always felt like as soon as I enter these museums, I need to prove I deserve to be there. I need to tell them that I'm a curator myself. I don't think if you have that experience, you're imagining it, because that's how I feel myself. I think many of these spaces inherited a kind of language that was never really designed with ordinary visitors in mind. I noticed something else, something even more disturbing and stranger, because making people feel small is one thing, making them pay to feel small is another thing. And that's where the story just gets really uncomfortable. The more I thought about it, the more I realized something. Feeling like you don't belong isn't just emotional. Sometimes it is financial too. And I know museums need money. They have staff to pay. They have objects to maintain. They have buildings to maintain too. They have a lot of objects in their reserves that they have to preserve and look for. And none of that is free. That isn't me saying museums should never charge admission. That's a much bigger conversation. But there is one thing I can't stop thinking about. Imagine you've traveled halfway across the world, not to see the Eiffel Tower, not to go shopping, but only because you want to stand in front of these objects, some things that your grandparents told you stories about. Something that came from your own region, your own part of the world, like a small piece of home. And then, before you've even walked through these doors, you are asked to buy a ticket. Again, that's not necessarily the problem of money. The question that keeps bothering me is that whose story are we paying to enter? Take those winged bowls that I was standing beneath. They weren't always there in that gallery. In the 1840s, a French consul named Paul-Émile Botta was excavating the ancient Assyrian palace of King Sargon II at Khorsabad in modern-day Iraq. He uncovered these colossal guardians, those Lamassus, shipped them across the Mediterranean, and eventually they were hauled into this very hall in the Louvre. I'm talking about here. They didn't arrive there by accident. They arrived through empire, through a system where one European power had the resources and had the confidence, in fact, to take monumental objects and treasures from the Middle East and display them in the heart of Paris. That actually has happened to objects from my own country too. Madame Dieu-Lafroy, with her husband, turned the stones and reliefs of Persepolis into pieces, even Susa, especially Susa, into pieces just to be able to ship them to France. And the things that they couldn't ship, they destroyed. Yeah, those bowls are just one example. Think of Egyptian temples. Think of the Benin Bronzes. Countless objects from Asia, Africa, South America, the Middle East. Every object has its own story. And those stories aren't always comfortable. I sometimes wonder what it must feel like. Of course, I know the answer to that because I've imagined it all my life. But, to grow up hearing about these objects, these fascinating, incredible pieces of your own history, only to discover that they are now thousands of kilometers away from home, displayed behind glasses in another country with another institution deciding how your story is told. And then, to add insult into injury, being charged a premium admission just to be able to see your own history there. Because some museums now are adding a foreigner premium higher prices for visitors from abroad. They aren't local, so they have to pay a markup price. So the very people whose heritage was stolen are now being asked to pay more to see it. Honestly, I know what that feels like, and it is not comfortable. Every time I think about it, I come back to that man. Maybe I was completely wrong about him. Maybe those sculptures meant nothing to him, and maybe I was just projecting my own feelings into this person who was another tourist, ordinary tourist. I can't know. But what struck me wasn't where he came from. It was how naturally he reached towards those objects. As if for a split second, there wasn't a museum between him and the past. There weren't those walls. As if there was only stone, only history, only curiosity. And maybe that's what museums are constantly asking us to negotiate. You know, not just what happened in the past, but who gets to decide what the past means? Who gets to tell the story? Who gets to write the label? Who decides which objects travel and which stay home? Those aren't archaeological decisions. Those aren't archaeological questions either. They are human ones. For decades, when countries asked for their own objects back, the big Western institutions gave them a nudge, a condescending reply. We can't give you these back. You don't have the right facilities to keep them. You cannot keep them safe. But let's be honest, this excuse is wearing thin. Many of those countries now have world-class gears and museums of their own. And even if they didn't, is it really the height of arrogance to steal someone's past, someone's history, and then lecture them on how to preserve it? I honestly don't know if there's a perfect answer for that. I don't think there is one, but I do know that pretending these questions don't exist doesn't make them disappear. And then I realized something else. Even after you've made it into the museum, through the doors, even after you've paid that markup price for your ticket, there is still one more barrier waiting for you inside the museum. One that almost nobody talks about. It isn't made of stones, or glass, or money. It's made of words. And the last thing I started paying attention to was the labels. Not what they said, but the way they sounded. Have you ever done this? You walk out to an object, you're really curious about it, you want to know more, you're genuinely interested, and the moment you start reading, you feel disconnected. And by the second sentence, your eyes just glaze over. You read the same paragraph 3 times, and you still have no idea what you just read. And somehow, you end up feeling like you were maybe the only person who has that problem and everyone else gets it in the museum. Like everyone else understands this language except from you. I've actually felt that way many times. Much more times than I'd like to admit. And considering that I've studied this major and I've spent years studying museums, working in museums, that's saying something. Most museum labels aren't actually written for us, the visitors. They're written for experts, by experts. They're accurate, they're scholarly, they're carefully researched, and not always human. Let me give you an example. Right now in a museum, there's a label that reads Lamassu, Neo-Assyrian, Gypsum Alabaster, 883 to 859 BCE, excavated by P.E. Botha, the Louvre Museum. Accurate? Definitely. Informative? Technically. But here's what the label doesn't tell you. It doesn't tell you that this bull once guarded a palace gate where soldiers marched and servant worked and passed by, that enemies once feared these exact guards, that generations of people just walked past it, lived underneath it, prayed about it, prayed near it, lived their whole lives under its shadow. It doesn't tell you the meaning of these bowls. It doesn't tell you what the bowl body represents, which is strength, what the human head means, which is wisdom, and what the wings of an eagle mean, which is freedom. The three core values of the Mesopotamian civilizations: freedom, wisdom, and strength. It doesn't tell you who loved them, who carried them, who missed them after they were gone, or after this capital was deserted. That's the part I always look for in museums, and I always find myself enthusiastic about. Because history isn't just about objects. It has never been about only objects. It's always been about people. What this language really does is to send a clear signal, quietly, that this space is for experts, for academics, not for you. And if you ever felt bored or felt that you don't belong inside a museum or confused in a museum, listen to me. It's not a personal failing, believe me. It's the museum actively using the language to keep you at a distance. I keep coming back to that man. Not because I know who he was, I don't. Not because I know exactly what those bowls meant to him, I don't know that for sure. But because for a few seconds, before the guards shouted, the museum disappeared. There was no institution, no bowls, no labels, just two living things, a human being and a piece of stone, trying to meet each other. For one tiny moment, history wasn't being lectured to us or explained. It was being felt. I don't think museums should, be afraid of that kind of connection. Sometimes I wonder what museums would feel like if they trusted us, the visitors. Not to touch anything, of course, I'm not suggesting that, but some objects are really fragile and we have to be careful about them. Preserving them really matters. But to trust us emotionally, to trust that we don't need to be intimidated to feel respectful, that we don't need complicated language to be curious or to appreciate the information that is conveyed through these objects. That wonder doesn't just disappear because people laugh or ask questions or admit that they don't know something or maybe don't understand something. Maybe it actually grows that wonder. When I think back to my first visit to the Louvre, I remember that feeling of, being an outsider, just as I told you about my experience at the École du Louvre in the previous video. I carried that feeling with myself into the Louvre. Like everyone else had received a map or an invisible instruction or manual, and I hadn't. But now I wonder if that wasn't really my feeling. Maybe it was the feeling that the space wanted me to have and quietly taught me to have. And once I realized that, something really changed. I stopped trying to be the perfect museum visitor. I stopped trying to be that person who knows everything in the museum and acts like they don't need any kind of instruction or any kind of explanation. I asked more questions. I spent less time sounding intelligent and more time paying attention to what I actually felt. Because the feelings that we receive in front of objects or artifacts are much more important than the information. I'm not saying that, information does not matter. Maybe they're equally important. And ironically, that's when museums felt much more interesting and much more enjoyable to me. And at that time that I started enhancing the skill in myself, I felt less of museum fatigue. Not because I learned more facts, because I finally gave myself the permission to have my relationship with the objects and with the museum. Maybe that's all I'm trying to tell you in this channel. Maybe that's all I'm trying to do in this channel. You know, not convincing you that museums are good or bad or troublesome or broken. Just to look at them differently. To notice the little things that we walk past. The architecture, the silence, the labels, the rules. And ask yourselves, why does this place make me feel the way it does? Because that question tells us just as much about ourselves as it does about museums. So next time you're standing in front of an object, or one of those enormous galleries, surrounded by huge objects that have survived thousands of years, don't worry so much about knowing everything and behaving the right way. You belong in that story too. Not because you're an expert, not because you've read everything about that or every label, but because human history belongs to humans, all of us. And that doesn't mean just accepting things as they are. It means asking for more. It means questioning the official narrative and story on those labels, supporting the movements of repatriating artifacts, sharing your own experiences in these spaces. Because these buildings, these institutions, were built by people. And if they were built to reinforce power, they can be rebuilt by us to create connections. Which leaves me with this question for you. If we could strip away all the intimidation and all the gatekeeping that we experience sometimes in museums, all the silent signals that tell us that we don't belong there, what does a museum that is truly for us actually look like? What would it feel like to walk into a gallery and not feel small? To look into a label, to read it and not feel stupid? To stand before an object from your own past and your own story and feel not like a visitor, but an owner? Obviously not an owner of the object, but an owner of history. Maybe if we let ourselves imagine it, it will feel a little more real and a little more at home. Not a home that's guarded and gated, but a home that we actually live in. One we can't just touch, obviously, but we can experience with our minds, with our heart, instead of our hands. And then with our curiosity. One where we don't have to whisper. And now I'm curious, really. Has a museum ever made you feel that way? Like you don't belong? Like you have misbehaved? Or the other way around, has a museum made you feel like you really belong there? I'd genuinely love to hear about it. Because something tells me that I'm not the only one who's been thinking about this. And by the way, instead of making those lamassus, I decided to make this. This was used like a sigil in the Assyrian civilization, and it is said to be the Assyrian rosette. If you search it, you will definitely see it on the reliefs, like some bracelets that figures on reliefs would wear. Sometimes it is around their ankles, and it is said to have protected the warriors or the historical figures from many unfortunate things. And you can also see these rosettes in other civilizations as well, like, for example, in Persepolis. And that tells you perfectly how pieces of art, ideas, and stories travel across the world. Thank you for listening. I'm Sarah, a curator and a storyteller, and in this channel, I tell you what culture made of me. If you liked this video, I suggest you hit that subscribe button, you like it, and leave me comments about your ideas, please. And that's it for today. Thanks for watching.